February 14, 1965. 7:40 p.m. Harlem. A narrow hallway. One flickering bulb. Paint peeling like old skin. The building breathed the way old buildings do, slow, tired, hiding things in the walls. A revolver rested in a man's hand. Not raised. Not shaking. Just heavy. Cold enough to keep him awake. Footsteps crept from the stairwell. Careful. Measured. Whoever was coming had practiced this walk. Knew how sound traveled. Knew how men died in places like this. Inside the apartment, Malcolm X stood near the window, coat still on, hat pulled low. He didn't move. He listened. The smell of damp wood mixed with stale cigarette smoke clung to the room. His palm was slick with sweat, but his face didn't show it. A metallic click echoed from the hallway. Not a gunshot. A mistake. And that mistake would quietly reroute history. Malcolm didn't know it yet, but this was the night Harlem decided who would protect him, and who wouldn't. How it came to that, we'll get there. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in, thick enough to feel against the skin. Malcolm tasted fear, sharp, metallic, familiar. The kind he'd known in prison. The kind that never lies. He stepped closer to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. Down on 165th Street, a black car idled with its lights off. Engine low. Patient. Like it had nowhere else to be. Someone wanted him aware. Not dead. Not yet. The door behind him opened without a knock. A large man entered, filling the room the way gravity fills space. Tailored suit. Broad shoulders. Calm eyes that had seen too many endings to rush toward another one. Cigar smoke followed him in, warm and bitter. "Lock it," the man said quietly. The door shut. The bolt slid home. The room felt smaller now. "You hear them?" the man asked. Malcolm nodded. "I saw them." The man crossed to the window, looked once, then closed the curtain. His movements were unhurried, precise. He didn't need more than a second. "They left," he said. "On purpose." Malcolm turned. "Why?" "So you'd feel it," the man replied. "So you'd think about who you'd call." Malcolm held his gaze. "I didn't call the police." For the first time, something like approval flickered across the man's face. "That's good," he said. "Because tonight the police don't get you home." He reached into his coat and placed a folded paper on the table. The sound was soft, but final. Names. Addresses. Times. Ink pressed hard enough to tear the page beneath. Malcolm recognized planning when he saw it. "You're sure?" Malcolm asked. The man poured cognac into a glass and slid it across the table. The smell burned Malcolm's nose. "I don't bring paper unless I'm sure," he said. Malcolm didn't touch the drink. Outside, jazz floated up from the street below, then cut off mid-note like someone killed the sound with a switch. Silence rushed back in. "They've been asking questions," the man continued. "Wrong ones. Loud ones." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "From the nation." The man didn't answer right away. He just looked at him. Long enough for the truth to settle without being spoken. That silence mattered. It would matter later. Footsteps echoed again, closer this time. More than one pair. Heavier. Less careful. Malcolm's heartbeat thudded once. Twice. The man moved, not toward a gun, but toward the light. He flipped it off. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. Malcolm felt presences appear around him. Men he hadn't seen. Men he trusted without knowing their names. "You feel that?" the man whispered. "Yes." "That ain't fear," he said. "That's timing." A knock slammed against the door. Art. Angry. Malcolm's breath slowed. He didn't pray. He remembered. Prison cells. Sermons. Crowds chanting his name. Leaving the nation. Walking away from protection he didn't trust anymore. This was the cost. The man leaned in close, his breath warm, heavy with smoke. "Whatever happens next," he said, "remember this, Harlem protects its own." The knock came again. Louder. The door handle turned. And somewhere, already in motion, a plan began unfolding that no one in that hallway could stop. Before the knock. Before the lists, the shadows, the quiet men in borrowed coats, there was Harlem the way it used to be. 1940s Harlem smelled like sweat and ambition. Jazz spilled from basement doors. Dice clattered in alleys. Every block had a boss. Every boss answered to someone, and everyone knew when they were lying. Power wasn't loud then. It was understood. That's where Malcolm learned the street. Back when they called him Detroit Red, he moved fast and dressed sharper than his future allowed. Silk suits. Flashy smiles. Hunger in his eyes. He learned early that the law didn't protect you, it cataloged you. Survival came from reading people before they read you. Bumpy was already there. Older. Quieter. Watching. He didn't approach Malcolm. Didn't test him. Didn't recruit him. He let the street do what it always did, apply pressure and see what bent. Malcolm didn't bend. He adapted. That's what caught Bumpy's attention. Years passed. Prison swallowed Malcolm whole, then spit him back out remade. Faith burned off the excess. Discipline carved him down to something lean and dangerous. When he returned to Harlem, he wasn't chasing money anymore. He was chasing meaning. The Nation of Islam gave him a platform. A voice. A shield. Harlem listened because Malcolm spoke like a man who'd already lost everything once and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Crowds grew. Messages sharpened. The city leaned in. And Bumpy watched it all from a distance. Preachers came and went. Politicians too. But Malcolm stayed. He learned how to hold a room without raising his voice. How to let silence do the threatening. That skill made powerful people uneasy. Because silence can't be interrupted. By the early 1960s, the tension was visible if you knew where to look. Meetings inside the nation got colder. Smiles thinned. Loyalty started to feel conditional. Malcolm noticed the pauses when he entered rooms. The way conversations stopped just a second too fast. He didn't say anything. He never said anything when it mattered most. Then the break came. Public. Final. No safety net. Malcolm walked away from the Nation of Islam with nothing but his name, and a lot of people who felt betrayed by it. That's when the phone calls started. Heavy breathing. Hushed threats. Letters with no return address. Men standing across the street a little too long. Harlem felt the shift instantly. People crossed to the other side of the street when Malcolm passed, not out of fear of him but fear for him. The kind that spreads quietly and refuses to be reassured. Bumpy heard about it the same way he heard about everything, through the rhythm of the city changing. Clubs closing early. Men drinking slower. Too many conversations ending with the same unfinished sentence. He's on his own now. That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. Bumpy didn't move right away. He never did. He waited for patterns. And the pattern was clear. This wasn't about disagreement anymore. It was about erasure. One night, a messenger found Bumpy in the back of a club. Rain-soaked. Nervous. Eyes darting. "They're serious," the man whispered. "This ain't talk." Bumpy didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He nodded once and dismissed the messenger. Then he sat there long after the music stopped, cigar burned down to ash between his fingers. Malcolm hadn't called yet. That mattered. It meant Malcolm was still weighing something. Pride. Principle. Or maybe trust. When the call finally came, it wasn't dramatic. No desperation. Just a quiet request passed through intermediaries. No police. No headlines. No uniforms. Just the street. That choice changed everything. Because asking Bumpy Johnson for protection wasn't like hiring guards. It was declaring allegiance to a different kind of order. One the law didn't recognize, but everyone respected. Bumpy agreed without shaking hands. Without promises. Without witnesses. He just said, "I'll handle it." And from that moment on, Malcolm wasn't alone anymore. But protection has a price that isn't paid in money. It paints a target. And somewhere someone noticed the shift. Someone decided that if Malcolm was protected, he needed to be removed faster. The street was already adjusting. And the clock had started ticking. Protection changes a man. Not on the outside. Malcolm still walked straight, still spoke calm, still met eyes without flinching. But inside something tightened. Awareness sharpened. Every room got mapped the second he entered. Exits. Angles. Faces that lingered too long. The street had wrapped itself around him quietly. Different cars showed up on different days. Familiar faces rotated without pattern. Men who looked like neighbors leaned against walls a little too long, watching reflections instead of streets. It wasn't obvious. That was the point. Malcolm noticed everything. "You're hiding me in plain sight," he said one night as he walked beside Bumpy. Bumpy didn't look at him. Hiding gets you found. They passed a storefront window. Malcolm caught his reflection, older than he remembered, sharper. The weight of consequence sat on his shoulders like a tailored coat. "What happens if they come anyway?" Malcolm asked. Bumpy stopped walking. Turned slowly. Streetlight caught the lines in his face. "Then they won't come twice." That answer wasn't comfort. It was a warning. Because protection wasn't armor. It was a delay. And delays make people impatient. The threats changed shape after that. Calls stopped. Letters disappeared. No more men standing across the street too long. Silence returned. But it was wrong. The kind of quiet that feels staged. Malcolm felt it during sermons. Eyes in the crowd that didn't blink. Hands that stayed buried in coats even when the room got warm. He kept speaking, kept pausing, kept letting his words land, but his mind was already ahead, tracking something unseen. Someone was learning his rhythm. That's when Bumpy knew they were close. He adjusted again. Routes changed daily. Entrances rotated. Time shifted at the last minute. Even the men doing the watching didn't always know the full plan. Compartmentalization. If one piece fell, the rest survived. But belief doesn't compartmentalize. Belief commits. And somewhere that commitment was hardening into resolve. The warning came 2 nights before the end. A trusted man slipped into Bumpy's office after midnight. Didn't sit. Didn't relax. "They're not backing off," he said. "They're consolidating." Bumpy exhaled slowly. "Where?" "Public. That's the problem." Public meant crowds. Witnesses. Confusion. It meant rules shifted. It meant Bumpy couldn't control the whole board. He sent word immediately. Quietly. "No panic." Malcolm received the message and nodded once. "Then it happens where everyone can see," he said. Bumpy studied him. "You could cancel." Malcolm shook his head. "Then they win without moving." That decision sealed something neither of them said out loud. The last walk they took together was short. Cold wind. Empty street. Their footsteps echoed between brick walls. "If this goes bad," Malcolm said, "don't turn it into a war." Bumpy stopped. Looked at him hard. "You don't tell me how to respond." "I'm not," Malcolm said. "I'm telling you what they want." That landed. Bumpy's jaw tightened. He nodded once. "Go speak," he said. "I'll handle the rest." That promise carried weight. The night before the speech, Malcolm barely slept. The room smelled like dust and old paper. His thoughts circled, then slowed. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of unfinished work. Morning came gray and thin. Harlem moved differently that day. Quieter. Expectant. As if the city itself was holding something back. Men noticed it without naming it. So did Bumpy. By mid-afternoon, positions were set. Eyes in place. Doors watched. Everything that could be done was done. But belief had already crossed the point of control. And the moment Malcolm stepped toward that stage, everyone, street, city, enemy, leaned forward. Because whatever happened next wouldn't just end a life. It would answer a question Harlem had been asking for years. Who really decides what happens here? February 21, 1965. Afternoon light pressed weakly against the windows of the Audubon Ballroom. Winter clung to coats and breath. The room filled slowly, chairs scraping, voices overlapping, anticipation thick enough to taste. Malcolm stood behind the curtain, fingers resting on the edge of a chair. The fabric felt rough. Real. Grounding. He listened, not to the crowd but to the room itself. The way sound traveled. The way silence lingered just a fraction too long after laughter. Something wasn't right. He didn't know what yet. Only that the air felt loaded. Men Bumpy had placed were already in position. Not together. Never together. An usher near the aisle. A man 2 rows back pretending to read a program. Another leaning against the wall, eyes on reflections instead of faces. No visible protection. No obvious threat. That invisibility was the plan. Malcolm stepped onto the stage. Applause rolled forward, uneven and uncertain. Some hands clapped hard. Others hesitated. A few stayed still. He raised his hand and the room quieted. That power, that pause, was something he'd earned the hard way. Brothers and sisters. The shout cut through the room like a blade. "Get your hand out of my pocket." Chairs scraped. People turned. Confusion rippled outward, sudden and sharp. For a split second it looked like nothing, just disorder. Then the first shot cracked. Sound exploded. A dry, violent snap that tore the air open. Malcolm's body jolted as heat ripped through his chest. The smell of gunpowder flooded the room, harsh and bitter. Screams followed instantly, stacking on top of each other, bouncing off the walls. Another shot. Then another. Time slowed in fragments. A man lunged from the aisle, one of Bumpy's, but he was a half-second late. Someone tackled the second attacker near the front row, bodies crashing into chairs. Wood splintered. A gun clattered across the floor. Malcolm fell backward. The stage felt cold against his back. His breath came shallow. Blood soaked into his coat, warm and slick. The ceiling lights blurred into white streaks. He tasted copper. Around him, chaos tried to bloom, but it didn't fully take. Doors closed. Men shouted short, sharp commands. The crowd was pushed down, not out. Contained. Controlled. A third attacker hesitated, panicked, then disappeared into the surge. Outside, engines roared. Tires screamed against pavement. A gunshot echoed after them, missed. 3 blocks away, Bumpy Johnson stood under a streetlight as rain began to fall. A phone was pressed to his ear. He said nothing, listening as pieces came through, broken, breathless. He's hit. 2 attackers down, crowd contained. Bumpy closed his eyes. This was the part he could never plan for. The sirens rose fast. Too fast. Cutting through the rain, through the shock, through history trying to decide what it would become. Bumpy lowered the phone slowly. His hand trembled once before he steadied it. He didn't swear. Didn't shout. He just stood there, rain soaking his coat, watching the light buzz overhead. Inside the ballroom, men were already moving Malcolm, hands slick with blood, voices urgent but controlled. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling heavy on every chest. Everyone felt the same thing then. This wasn't chaos. This was collision. And when the sirens finally swallowed the street, Harlem understood something it would never forget. Protection had limits. Belief didn't. Harlem didn't explode after Malcolm died. It withdrew. Radios lowered their volume. Store owners stood in doorways without speaking. Men who usually argued on corners stared straight ahead, hands buried deep in coat pockets. The city didn't panic, it calculated. Because if Malcolm X could be killed in public, in daylight, with witnesses everywhere, then rules had changed. And when rules changed, the underworld listens first. Bumpy felt the shift before the headlines finished printing. He sat in his study, lights low, coat still on. The room smelled like rain-soaked wool and burned tobacco. A glass sat untouched in front of him. He hadn't earned the drink yet. Messages came in quietly. 1 attacker dead. 1 captured. 1 gone. That last one sat wrong in his gut. Gone meant protected. Or hidden. Or traded. And trades always came with consequences. Men stopped by without being called. Spoke in fragments. Left without waiting for replies. Bumpy absorbed it all without comment. He didn't ask questions that didn't need answers yet. The street wanted to know one thing. Was Bumpy going to respond? Because silence after a public killing could be mistaken for weakness. And weakness invited repetition. That night, Bumpy walked Harlem alone. No car. No visible muscle. Just leather shoes on wet pavement. The city smelled like damp brick and old memories. Somewhere, a trumpet played slow and wounded, notes bending under their own weight. A young man stepped out of a doorway and blocked his path. Eyes wide. Voice shaking. You gonna let this stand? He asked. Bumpy studied him. Not with anger. With curiosity. Stand? Bumpy repeated. What they did, the kid said. To Malcolm. Bumpy leaned in close, his voice low enough to disappear into the rain. I don't answer loud, he said. I answer permanent. The word permanent moved faster than any threat could. Within days things began to happen, but never where reporters could see. Money dried up in strange places. Safe locations stopped being safe. Men showed up expecting backup and found empty rooms instead. No bodies in the streets. No declarations of war. Just absence. Fear didn't roar. It settled. People started sleeping with lights on. Phones rang less. Promises felt thinner. Everyone wondered if they'd already missed the moment they were supposed to be somewhere else. That was Bumpy's response. Not revenge. Correction. Because making Malcolm's death loud would have turned him into a warning. Bumpy refused that. Instead, he made the reaction terrifying. Weeks passed. Harlem adjusted the way cities always do, by pretending normal was still possible. But something had been cut out. Conversations felt cautious. Laughter didn't linger. Bumpy stood at his window one night, looking down at the street Malcolm once walked freely. Sirens wailed in the distance, then faded. He finally lifted the glass and drank. The burn hit hard. This city don't forget, he said softly. And it didn't. Malcolm's voice echoed in sermons long after his body was gone. His absence became heavier than his presence ever was. And Bumpy understood something most men never do. You can protect a man from bullets. You can't protect him from history. But you can decide what history does next. And that decision was already in motion. Harlem carried Malcolm after he was gone. Not in marches. Not in speeches. In posture. Men stood straighter. Conversations paused longer before answers came. People chose words like they mattered again. That kind of change doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from witnessing a line crossed that can't be uncrossed. Bumpy Johnson watched it happen from the edges. He didn't attend memorials. didn't give quotes, didn't step into the light people expected him to occupy. Power like his survived by understanding when not to be seen. But everyone felt his presence anyway. The street had learned something brutal and precise. Violence could interrupt a voice, but it couldn't erase meaning. And that truth scared the wrong people. The nation fractured quietly after that. No headlines. No announcements. Just influence thinning. Loyalty scattering. Men who once spoke with certainty suddenly choosing silence. Not because of Bumpy directly, but because the world had shifted beneath their feet. Killing Malcolm hadn't restored order. It had exposed it. Bumpy received a message weeks later. No signature. No threat. Just a sentence written clean and simple. This didn't end the way we planned. Bumpy read it once. Folded it carefully. Slid it into a drawer he never opened again. Because he already knew. The real outcome of that day wasn't death. It was clarity. Harlem now understood the difference between authority and legitimacy. Between power taken and power earned. Malcolm had crossed that threshold, and even in death he stood on the other side of it. Bumpy poured himself another drink one night and sat alone, listening to the city breathe. Cars passed. Footsteps echoed. Somewhere a radio played a familiar voice, recorded but alive. He thought back to something Malcolm once said, walking beside him in the cold. They'll remember the idea longer than the man. At the time, Bumpy hadn't replied. Now he did, quietly to an empty room. You were right. Because history didn't record who pulled the trigger as clearly as it recorded why the trigger mattered. And protection in the end wasn't about stopping death. It was about shaping what followed. Bumpy had done that. Not with guns. Not with speeches. But with restraint. That was his real power. Years later, people would argue about whether Malcolm calling Bumpy instead of the police had been reckless or brilliant. They'd debate legality, morality, alliances. But Harlem never debated it. Harlem understood. When the law couldn't move fast enough. When institutions became threats. When belief turned lethal. Malcolm chose the only protection that spoke the same language as danger. And Bumpy answered. That bond, formed in shadows, tested in blood, became legend not because it saved a life, but because it revealed the truth. Sometimes the most powerful protection isn't a badge. It's respect. And respect doesn't die easily. If this story hit you, like it, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what moment stayed with you the longest. Because if you think this alliance was unexpected, wait until you hear what happened the night Bumpy Johnson sat face to face with Lucky Luciano, and neither man blinked first. That story? That one changed the underworld forever.